Let me tell you about the worst night of my life. It was a few years back when I was working the night shift at a small gas station just off a lonely highway. This place was old, falling apart, and barely saw any traffic, especially at night. It was the kind of place people would avoid if they had the option. But for me, it was a job, and I needed the money. One Friday night, I was working alone, as usual. The shift started out like any other, quiet, empty, with the occasional trucker stopping by for gas and coffee. The clock seemed to be stuck in slow motion, and the silence was only broken by the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant croaking of frogs from the swamp nearby. Around 2 a.m., the temperature dropped suddenly. It was strange because it was the middle of summer, and the air had been thick with humidity all day. I remember pulling on my jacket and wondering if the old air conditioner had finally kicked the bucket. But then I heard the bell above the door jingle. I looked up, expecting to see a customer, but there was no one there. The door was still slightly ajar, swaying back and forth as if someone had just walked in. I stepped out from behind the counter and walked over to the door, peering outside. Nothing. Just the dark stretch of the highway, the empty parking lot, and the dense woods beyond. I closed the door, thinking maybe the wind had pushed it open, and went back to my seat behind the counter. But as soon as I sat down, the bell jingled again. This time, it wasn't just a slight jingle. It was loud, as if someone had pushed the door open with force. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stood up, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't right. I slowly walked over to the door again, and as I reached for it, it slammed shut on its own, nearly catching my fingers. I stumbled back, my heart racing. I was sure I'd locked the door. I had checked it a dozen times since starting my shift. My first thought was that someone was messing with me. Maybe some kids were playing a prank. But as I stood there, staring at the door, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, but there was no one behind me. Just the empty store with its shelves of snacks and drinks, all bathed in that harsh, flickering light. I was beginning to feel uneasy, my thoughts racing, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was just tired. It was late, after all. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move by the window. It was just a shadow, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I forced myself to go outside and take a look, convincing myself that it was just a trick of the light. As I stepped outside, the night was eerily quiet. No wind, no cars passing by, nothing. Just the oppressive darkness. I walked around the building, my eyes straining to see through the shadows. Then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper coming from the woods behind the station. I took a few steps towards the woods, trying to see if anyone was out there. But the closer I got, the colder the air became, and the whispering grew louder. It sounded like multiple voices now, all overlapping, their words still indistinct. My instincts were screaming at me to turn back, to get inside where it was safe, but I was frozen in place, staring into the blackness of the woods. And then out of nowhere, the voices stopped. The silence was deafening. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. I finally forced myself to turn around and head back inside, my legs feeling like lead. As I reached the door, I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I didn't dare turn around. I just rushed inside and locked the door behind me, my hands shaking. For the next hour, I sat behind the counter, clutching a baseball bat I kept under the register. I was on high alert, my eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of light. But nothing happened. The door didn't open, the bell didn't jingle, and the footsteps didn't return. It was as if whatever had been there had decided to leave me alone. But just as I was beginning to calm down, something even more terrifying happened. The lights in the store flickered and then went out, plunging me into complete darkness. The only light came from the dim glow of the emergency exit sign above the door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to find my way to the breaker box in the back room. As I opened the door to the back room, the smell hit me, something rotten, like spoiled meat. I gagged, covering my nose with my sleeve as I shone the flashlight around. The smell was coming from the far corner, near the old storage closet. I approached it slowly, every instinct telling me to turn back, but I had to know what was causing that stench. When I reached the closet, I hesitated before opening it. My hand was trembling as I grabbed the handle and pulled the door open. Inside, there was nothing but old supplies and a few boxes, but the smell was overwhelming. I shone the light around, trying to find the source, when I noticed something on the floor, something dark and wet. I knelt down, shining the light on it, and that's when I saw it. It was a stain, a dark, reddish-brown stain, seeping up through the floorboards. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it blood? I reached out to touch it, but as soon as my fingers brushed the stain, a loud bang echoed through the room, and the door slammed shut behind me. I jumped up, my heart racing, and ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but I knew no one would hear me. I was alone. And then, the whispering started again, this time right in my ear. It was like a dozen voices all speaking at once, their words garbled and frantic. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it only grew louder, more insistent. The smell of decay filled the room, and I felt something cold brush against my neck. I whipped around, shining the light wildly, but there was nothing there. Just the darkness, closing in on me. I could feel the walls pressing in, the air growing colder, thicker. My vision blurred, and I felt like I was suffocating. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The door flew open, and I stumbled out, gasping for air. The lights in the store flickered back on, and everything seemed normal again. But I knew what I had experienced wasn't just my imagination. I grabbed my things, leaving the station without locking up, and drove home as fast as I could. I quit the next day and never looked back. I found out later that the gas station had a dark history. Years before I worked there, it had been the site of a grisly murder. A drifter had attacked the night clerk, killing him and leaving his body in that same back room. The killer was never caught, and the station had been abandoned for years before it was reopened under new management. I don't know if what I experienced was a ghost or something else entirely, but I know one thing for sure: I'll never work a night shift at a gas station again.